Hi, I'm Graeham Watts with Interor Real Estate, and today I'm going to give you the ins and outs of AB 1482, which is here in California. Which properties are subject to and exempt from AB 1482, how it all works. This is a guide for tenants and landlords in the state of California for the statewide rent control bill that we have, and we're going to run through which properties are subject to or exempt from AB 1482. I'm going to talk to you also about how much landlords can or can't increase rent. I'm going to go over when a landlord can terminate tenancy, because if you terminate tenancy, sometimes you can know relocation assistance. And stick around to the end because I'm going to answer one of those common questions, which is what happens if you miss the deadline to give your tenant this notice. So for properties that are subject to AB 1482, if you're going to ask the tenant to move out, which is no fault of the tenant, you probably owe relocation assistance in that case. One of the first reasons is the intent to occupy the property by an owner, a spouse, or a grandchild, or a parent, but it can't be like a cousin or anyone like that. It has to be it's a pretty straight line there. It has to be a very close relative. The next big category would be the withdrawal of the property from the rental market. This isn't a case where you just want to get the people out and raise the rent. You cannot rent that property out again. And again, you might owe relocation assistance in that case. And the other reason would be if you need to comply with some kind of government order to get the tenant out. Now here's where it gets tricky. If the reason for the government order is because of the tenant, then you probably don't owe relocation assistance in that case. But in all the other cases we just discussed, then you probably do. The last reason you're going to owe potentially relocation assistance to your tenant if you ask them to move out under 8B 1482 would be if you are going to substantially remodel the property. Now, substantially is actually written into the legislation, and what it means is something that actually will need permits, and the tenant has to be out of the property for a minimum of 30 days because it's going to take that much work. Your relocation assistance is most likely going to be 1 month's rent, can be given to the tenant within 15 days after your notice, or it can be given by forgiving the last month's rent. It's be important to know to look at your local rules and speak to your attorney about that. If you're not subject to AB 1482, you don't have to worry about any of this and you don't owe any relocation assistance. Now, one of the biggest questions I get is, what if I forgot to give my tenant notice? Well, you have to dive into the legislation, but first thing I'd highly recommend is definitely talk to an attorney because it's going to be fairly complex. But here's what the legislation says. So any tenancy before July 1st, 2020, it isn't required to be provided in the rental agreement. A lot of times I talk to landlords and they say, oh, I have a rental agreement, I'm just going to use that, or I found one online. Don't use it. Make sure that if you do use it, but don't use it, if you do use it, make sure it has the exemption language in it. Just a side note, if the tenancy was renewed even after July 1st of 2020, it still is required to be in that rental agreement, even if it's the same tenant. If you missed it and you missed that deadline, you might need to talk to an attorney. And if your project is subject to AB 1482, there's actually language that also needs to be included in the lease as well.